I figured it out.
Nice to see you, Pedro. I think everyone's coming in now, so we'll start in a few minutes.
Is Drew on?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was having trouble. I was signed into my Gmail account, and it turns out that you had sent the invite to my Fairvote account, so I had to switch accounts.
Great. Well, we're glad you joined, are able to join. Our participants are joining now, so I'm sharing my screen now, and then we'll pass it over to one of you to share your screen for your PowerPoint.
All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to session 3 on ranked choice voting. Last but certainly not least, please join me in welcoming Pedro Hernandez and Drew Penrose. Pedro is a senior policy coordinator at Fairvote with a passion for electoral reform and community advocacy. Drew is an elections policy expert and consultant for Fairvote, specializing in ranked choice voting and proportional representation. Pedro and Drew, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your passion for electoral reform this afternoon. I'm going to turn the floor over to you all and welcome you to tell us a bit more about yourselves, Fairvote, and your work around ranked choice voting and proportional representation.
Thanks very much. So my name is Drew Penrose. Until recently, I was the Law and Policy Director at Fairvote. I actually have left Fairvote to dedicate most of my time to parenting, but I'm still working with them as a consultant on a part-time basis, so still happy to represent them here. I was at Fairvote since 2012, so I had worked there for some time, working on the issues of ranked choice voting and proportional representation. And I'll just try to share my screen right now and get started. All right. So starting from where we are right now, our current way of electing people is a choice. It's a system that we call single choice plurality. So that is the system that probably most of you are familiar with. You vote for one candidate. The candidate with the most votes is the one that's ultimately elected and wins the election. So it has the benefit of simplicity, and actually it's a system that works just fine, provided you have exactly two choices. If you have two choices, one of them gets more than the other, there's really no controversy there. But of course, we don't always have two choices, nor would that be a good thing, right? People don't neatly fit into a binary of two choices. So, but when we have more than two choices, that's when single choice plurality can give us kind of strange results. So you could have the same essential preferences among the voters, and yet you could wind up with the opposite winner. This problem is not theoretical. So here we have a graph from this year's primary winners. These are just the primary winners who earned less than 35% of the vote in order to win their party's nomination. And fun story about this graph, I started out creating a graph of everyone who won less than 50%, but it was so many that it was unusable. You couldn't actually tell what was going on with the graph. So I changed it to less than 40%. That was still too many to actually be readable. And that's why this graph actually only shows candidates who won their primaries with less than 35% of the vote. You see people here winning with less than 20%, really, really small numbers of votes. And because most districts are safe Republican or safe Democratic districts, many of these people will go on and just sail to election, essentially earning a seat in Congress based on the votes of a tiny number of voters. The alternative to this that many people suggest are runoff elections, two-round runoff elections. So this is an example from Texas's 15th congressional district in 2010. Nobody had a majority. So as a result, they held a second election some weeks later. The problem with runoff elections, as you can actually tell from closely examining this, is that runoff elections don't get the same media attention. They don't have the same level of campaigning. And as a result, very few people turn out to vote in them. The turnout is not only smaller, it's also less representative. It tends to be older, whiter, more ideological voters. And here you see Zamora winning the runoff election with less than half the number of votes of Garza, the candidate who came in third and was eliminated in the first round. So the idea of runoffs protecting majority rule is a bit of an illusion when you wind up with so few people actually participating in the runoff election. The solution that Fair Vote proposes for this is ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, as you see with the ballot on your screen, you vote for your favorite candidate just like you do now, but you also get the option to say, this is my second choice, this is my third choice, and so on. And then it works just like an instant runoff. So based on the first choices, if nobody has a majority of the votes, what you're going to do is you're going to eliminate the candidate in last place. If your favorite candidate is eliminated, your vote instantly counts for your next choice. And you can just repeat that process until somebody does have a majority of the vote. So that way you get that benefit of runoff elections, of seeing who had the majority support, but you're not asking people to come back and vote a second time. You just ask them who their second choice was right there the first time when they vote. This was used for congressional elections in Maine for the first time in 2018. These are the results from Maine's 2nd congressional district, which was the one election in Maine that actually went to multiple rounds of counting. Every other ranked choice voting election was won with a majority in the first round. And here we see the Republican incumbent, Bruce Poliquin, had a very slight lead in the first round. But as the independents were eliminated, the bulk of their votes went to the Democrat. And in the final round, the Democrat showed that he actually had majority support. And Jared Golden is now the congressman from Maine's 2nd congressional district. Now, this doesn't mean that ranked choice voting gave Golden the win, really, in any sense. In fact, one thing we know is that Tiffany Bond asserted in court that had this election been conducted by single choice plurality, she would not have run. She wouldn't have run because she would have worried that she would have been a spoiler. A spoiler is a candidate that runs, tracks votes, winds up changing the outcome, but had no chance of actually winning. Ranked choice voting, in other words, gave us the majority support winner that we would have gotten with only 2 choices, but it allowed more to participate. There's more than 16,000 voters were able to honestly vote for their first choice. They wouldn't have had that option had it been a single choice plurality election. This generated some controversy, as you can imagine, with the Republican and later other Republicans in Maine. It kind of took on a partisan appearance, unfortunately, and a number of lawsuits. So ranked choice voting has survived lawsuits in state court and federal court, including most recently the Maine Republican Party attempting to put it back on the ballot to repeal it. The expansion of this system, which the legislature passed after the 2018 election, that all of that failed, basically, and ranked choice voting remains securely in place in Maine, and in fact will be expanded so that this year Maine will be the first state to conduct its presidential election by ranked choice voting. So voters in Maine will be ranking their choices when they go to vote for president. Voters like it in Maine. You know, we partnered with folks up there to do exit polling, and what we found is that more than 60% of voters favor either keeping ranked choice voting the way it was or expanding it to even more offices. And overwhelmingly, voters say it was very easy or somewhat easy. The biggest criticism we hear of ranked choice voting is that it's too complicated or it makes it harder to vote. But when you see that ballot, you know, your first choice, your second choice, your third choice, you realize it's actually a very straightforward thing. Americans love ranking things. You know, top 10 lists are everywhere. And it's a very natural way of making decisions in everyday life. So expanding it to voting totally makes sense. Now, there's a further problem that ranked choice voting can solve, and that's the issue of winner take all. So winner take all is a term that basically means the biggest group gets everything, nobody else gets anything. So this applies to multi-winner elections. So think of a city council, state legislature, or like the House of Representatives. Often they divide into districts, and you can imagine a situation where you've got a fairly diverse place as depicted on this picture, but where every district, the same group, happens to be the biggest one. And as a result, as this picture depicts, they would win every single seat as a result, leaving everybody else with no representation. The alternative, the ideal that we would want, is proportional representation, which is to say that each of the groups should get represented roughly proportional to their numbers. This is often done through districting, so people will fight over district lines. And as every state will be redistricting after 2021, we can expect to see a lot of fights over district lines. But you can actually accomplish this without using districts through the use of proportional ranked choice voting. So proportional ranked choice voting is just taking ranked choice voting and applying it to a multi-winner election, electing more than one person. More than one person will win, but everybody still has one vote. The difference is that if you've got a population, then instead of one candidate winning with more than half of the vote, as we saw under ranked choice voting, you'll have multiple candidates win, each with their own smaller share. So if you have two winners, you'll see that they're each competing for about a third of the vote. Three winners, they're each competing for their own, roughly 25%, anything greater than 25% of the vote. 4 winners, 5 winners, you start seeing more and more perspectives being represented because each group of voters is getting to elect their own representative. So as you see more winners, you see us approaching proportional representation. You also see that way more voters are actually electing a candidate that they support. So this system is used to elect the City Council of Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. They elect 9 winners at large, and what we see is that regularly more than 95% of voters have ranked a winner first, second, or third. Essentially, everyone who votes in Cambridge is actually represented in the city council by somebody that they voted for, that they helped elect, and that presumably will advocate for their interests when going in to the city council meetings. So proportional ranked choice voting gives us that full and fair representation. It essentially ends the gerrymandering system. This does not rely on districts to be able to achieve the benefits of proportional representation. Every election under this system is competitive because you'll have multiple people competing for smaller shares of the vote. And of course, you get more choices. And Pedro will talk a little bit more about how this is used in the real world, in the world of voting rights cases. This is an idea that's spreading all across the country. Both single and multi-winner ranked choice voting is used all over the place. In fact, in 2020, the Democratic Party used ranked choice voting in several of its presidential primaries. The field narrowed quite a bit after Super Tuesday, but folks may remember there was a pretty large number of candidates seeking the Democratic nomination, and ranked choice voting made sure that people were able to vote honestly. And they didn't have to worry, for instance, that they would cast a vote by mail and then their candidate would drop out before their vote had even been counted. That happened to lots and lots of voters across the country, but with ranked choice voting, their votes were just able to count for their next choices. But ranked choice voting is used in local elections all over the country. We're actually going to have 7 ballot measures for ranked choice voting in various places around the country this November. So it's expanding at a rate like nothing I've seen before. Really, it's very impressive. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pedro to tell us a little bit more about how these systems are used in the voting rights context. Pedro, do you want me to keep showing the slides or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. That would be fine.
Okay.
I was just thinking I could do mine, but you have yours up, so might as well save us the trouble. Thank you so much, Epic and Emory Law, for hosting us and for having this great symposium today. It's an honor to speak to you on what is my Saturday morning. I'm over on the West Coast. So my name again is Pedro Hernandez. I'm the Senior Policy Coordinator at Fair Vote. My background is actually in voting rights. I worked for an attorney in private practice before joining Fair Vote, doing state-based Voting Rights Act cases. But what we're going to be talking about today is kind of the junction of thinking about vote dilution in these issues of political geography when it comes to representation and voting rights. And Fair Vote does have some previous work in this space specifically. Fair Vote was helped to implement cumulative voting, which is a modified at-large remedy in the Portchester Federal Voting Rights Act case. And we also helped implement the first use of proportional ranked choice voting as a voting rights remedy in East Point, Michigan. That happened in November 2019. We're helping implement a hybrid system with proportional ranked choice voting in the city of Palm Desert, California. And we have also been active in as amicus parties in Higginson v. Becerra, which was a federal case challenging the constitutionality of the California Voting Rights Act. And we are currently an amicus supporting plaintiff in the city of Santa Monica case that is being appealed to the California Supreme Court. So there's a lot going on the state level as well. We're not really going to be seeing many, well, we haven't seen many DOJ cases come regarding voting rights cases come out in the last 4 years, but a lot of the action has around this kind of work has been happening on the state level. Next slide, please. So for folks who aren't necessarily, who are newer to this idea of vote dilution or winner-take-all systems leading to the abridgment of the voting rights of protected groups, the general concept is when you have an at-large winner-take-all system, it is possible that the largest block can lock out the representation opportunities of a protected minority. Take, for example, well, I can pass around the slides afterwards as well, but the idea is here is that we have the largest group, which is Aqua voters. They can essentially capture all of the seats by submerging, diluting the strength of the other groups. And this can be problematic, and it becomes a voting rights violation when it leads to these protected groups not being able to elect their candidates of choice. Yeah, so why don't we go into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I think what we're going to be focusing on here is the Section 2, the general prohibition on vote dilution. And you can kind of have these slides to reference to in the future, but next slide, please. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act essentially prohibits sort of devices that lead to vote dilution. It's a general prohibits racial discrimination in voting practices at federal, state, and local elections. Under Section 2, you can have changes to political geography that may be required to avoid minority vote dilution. And that can be challenges to the winner-take-all at-large system where protected minorities are cracked. And that's, you may have talked about this earlier today, but are cracked and divided into a number of larger districts, or where the protected communities are packed or placed into one district or only a few districts. Next slide, please. In order to bring these kinds of cases, you need to have a showing of a certain number of preconditions before you're able to bring these types of Section 2 cases. You know, is the minority group sufficiently large and geographically compact to make up a majority in a district? Is the minority group greater than 50% of citizen voting age population? Is the minority group politically cohesive? This means that the voters in the group tend to vote in favor of the same candidates and ballot positions. This can be a pretty big evidentiary burden on plaintiffs trying to bring a lawsuit to a local jurisdiction. And what it also does is really like focuses the remedy on single member districts as well. It's like you have to have this huge evidentiary burden in order to even bring your case in the first place. Next slide. And then there is also Senate factors, the Section 2 Senate factors, which is, you know, proving you can show a history of voting related discrimination, the extent of racially polarized voting, other voting practices dilute minority vote. Yeah, thank you. So in 2001, we see the introduction of the California Voting Rights Act, which expanded on the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, making it easier for protected groups in California to prove that their votes are being diluted in these at-large winner-take-all elections. And some of the architects are, Joaquin Avila of MALDEF and Robert Rubin, who was my former boss. So this is kind of a new way of thinking about, the power of the states in this voting rights space as well. Next slide, yeah. So it was signed into law in 2002. It eliminates the requirement that plaintiffs demonstrate a specific geographic district where a minority is concentrated enough to establish a majority. So that's that preconditions from Jingles. It essentially strips this huge evidentiary requirement that made it really difficult for protected groups to even have their case be heard in the first place. And the remedy provisions are written broadly enough to include a variety of options: district-based elections, and you can have community engagement in redistricting, and also modified at large, like proportional ranked choice voting and cumulative voting, and other changes like moving the election date. And here's an example of like where it made sense to actually not do district-based elections, but actually do a modified remedy. Here's the city of Mission Viejo, where you couldn't draw a district where Latinos were near 25%. So they implemented and are working on implementing cumulative voting. This is where voters will be able to vote for as many candidates as there are seats, and voters can assign all of their votes to one or more candidates. You don't have to, select, you have 5 votes, 5 different seats. You can actually use your 5 votes towards one person. This is known as a semi-proportional system or a single shot system, but it's also susceptible to vote splits. So proportional representation, why? It is a way to make the number of votes necessary to win more accessible for growing communities. We think, and this is from a community slide, an education slide that we did to kind of help gel the concept of like why it's fair. Instead of, when you use ranked choice voting, it's not winner take all. Candidates are elected in proportion to their vote share. Next slide. And you ask how? Well, we use election thresholds, and Drew kind of explained some of these concepts earlier. Because, so when we elect one under ranked choice voting, the number of votes necessary to win is 50% plus 1. When we elect 2, it's a third plus 1. When we elect 3, it's 25% plus 1. Why? Well, it's mathematically impossible for like a third person to get elected when you are only electing 2 with that amount. And this way, you can actually have more voters represented. When you're electing 3 and the threshold is 25% plus 1, at the result of that election, you're going to see 75% of voters be represented. That is pretty significant. So here's a literature piece from East Point, Michigan. And just to kind of show you some of, we were really excited to see that happen last year. Yeah, next slide. We might even be able to get to questions early. And there's a track record of proportional ranked choice voting in American cities. This is not a new concept. In fact, in the early 1900s, you saw many American cities use the system, and it was very effective at creating, electoral opportunities for smaller, ethnic or political minorities. And in Cambridge, we see 95% of voters get one of their top picks elected. Cambridge still uses this form of representation, and it was actually part of the National Municipal League Model Charter. One thing that's not in the slide, but I want to mention, is that there are 200 plus jurisdictions in this country that use a modified at-large system to elect their local councils. So these concepts are not new. And one thing I want to note was other states with their own voting rights acts. Washington has its own voting rights act, and so does Oregon. And in the works is New York. They have something in their legislature, and there's talk about an Illinois voting rights act as well.
And that's your last slide, right, Pedro?
And that is my last slide. But we can
Okay,
actually
great.
take questions early.
Yeah,
Oh,
I did see that there were some questions. Chelsea or Claire, did you want to lead that, or should I just go into the chat and take a look at the questions that are there?
It is whatever you would prefer. We were going to read them for you all, but if it's easier for you to read them, please feel free.
Okay, sure, why not? So, because I do see there are 3 here. Folks can feel free to ask other questions. We do have some additional time, but there's a lot of material that we can easily get into. So the first question is about voter confusion under a more complicated system. So, you know, our communications folks always tell us, always say it's simple, never say it's complicated. And I find that really hard to do. If you explain the vote counting to somebody, they're going to get that it's a step up, right, from just adding up all the votes and seeing who has the most. But there are 2 things that I tell people to keep in mind. One is that for voters, it's very simple. Your first choice, your second choice, your third choice. You see voter education campaigns where they're like, you know, who do you love? Who do you like? Who can you live with? Just rank your choices. As I mentioned earlier, ranking things is a normal way of making decisions in everyday life. In terms of the vote, go ahead, Pedro.
Yeah, I want to add that, like, I live in San Francisco and we have ranked choice voting here. We've had it since 2004. And I think one of the great things, I mean, there needs to be some education, obviously, and I think the best education is actually getting folks like a picture of the sample ballot, a picture of the ballot, so people know what it looks like. And that in San Francisco has been very effective. We have a pretty low error rate across the board. Not only that, is that we actually see a great use of rankings as well. I think in the 2018 mayoral election, we had like 86% of voters use at least 2 rankings, and now we have actually can go up to 10 rankings. So, you know, I think the jury's out is like at what point where you start seeing like people stop using their rankings when there are like 10 people running. And I think that'll be very informative. But I think I appreciate, you know, people wanting to know and concerned about like, well, that sounds a little confusing. Well, the actual instructions to fill out the ballot are actually quite straightforward. Pick your first choice, pick your second, pick your third, and then the counting. It's really a media issue as well, and it turns into a presentation issue. But there has been some great advancements in trying to make that more clear.
Yeah, we partnered with the Center for Civic Design to handle identify basically best practices in ballot design, because people talk a lot about voter education campaigns, but the reality is that most voters will never see your voter education campaign. The most important thing you can do is have a well-designed ballot, because that's the thing all voters are going to interact with. And we do see that with a well-designed ballot, voters do rank their choices and they make essentially no more errors than comparable single choice elections. So voter error is largely driven by the number of candidates in a race and some design choices. But with a well-designed ballot, we do get a good result. I do want to highlight the counting is, of course, more complicated. Voters, of course, don't have to do the counting, but there's concerns people naturally have with a more complicated vote counting process going on behind the scenes as well, and that's understandable. What I would emphasize is that although there are multiple steps taking place, none of it is arbitrary. So it's not like, you know, something complicated like the rules of cricket, right? Where you read the rules of cricket and you're just like, my God, whoever wrote these just loved rules. They just wanted all the rules they could have. Whereas with this, every single step that's taken is laser focused on making your vote as powerful as it can be. If your vote would be wasted, then it wants to say, well, you can't get your first choice. Let's see if you can help elect your second choice. Essentially directs your vote toward the most competitive race that it possibly can. And winds up making every vote very powerful. There are countries where this system has been used for a long time. It was invented in the 1860s and it was accused of being too complicated from its invention, but it does work very well where it's in use. How do we get RCV to Georgia? Are there any pitfalls? So advocacy is state and local based. I can't speak to what advocates there are in Georgia right now. There are folks working for this in basically every state, but the scenario varies quite a bit state to state. You can probably find a local advocate who's working on it in Georgia, but I don't know what it will mean. Some of the practical difficulties are like, can cities implement this on their own, or does the state have to pass a law allowing cities to do it? Is it actually forbidden by state law? Or are the voting machines ready to do it? Which is the case more and more and more places. Modern voting equipment can always do this. The next question is about the Electoral College. So Maine will be using in its presidential election, will be using single winner ranked choice voting in its presidential election to, well, single winner. Maine is a kind of a special case because it's one of the few states that awards electors on a congressional district basis. But there'll be a single winner ranked choice voting election in Congressional District 1, Congressional District 2, and statewide. I would not recommend using proportional RCV to select the Electoral College because the Electoral College fundamentally is not a representative body. You know, if you ask people which electors did you vote for, or ask people that are out there fighting to get more women elected to office, how many women are in the Electoral College? Like nobody knows, right? Because nobody cares. The Electoral College does one thing, and that's select the president. And so I actually, Fair Vote has endorsed the National Popular Vote Plan. I'm also a fan of the National Popular Vote Plan, even though that does not account for ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting will have to be something that comes later in terms of reforming the Electoral College. But in the meantime, states like Maine can implement it for the presidential elections. Yeah, right now, any state can do that. And then the last question is about the at-large election system. Pedro, did you want to speak some to the history of local places going to at-large elections?
Well, you know, we can go back in time. And that you might be better suited to kind of talk about the model. You know, when many states adopted kind of standards for political geography or local cities, a lot of them had at large. With proportional representation as part of the model statute. Unfortunately and sadly, the proportional aspect of it was either stripped away for political reasons or kind of repealed over time in many of these jurisdictions. And that is some of the legacy of the winner-take-all at-large system. Do you want to speak more to that?
Sure. So, you know, early in the country's founding, my focus is usually on Congress.
Yeah.
And early in the country's founding, a lot of states elected their congressional delegations at large. They used a system called the general ticket. In the early congressional elections, there were no primary elections. There were no secret ballots. You literally wrote names of candidates you wanted elected and put it in a box. And what would happen was the political parties would distribute ballots with their preferred candidates listed on them, and people would take those and they would just cast them. They'd put them in the glass box in front of the courthouse, the way voting usually worked back then. But one thing that meant was that if everyone was elected at large, the political party that had the largest base of support would be able to elect all of its candidates. And so that's why Congress eventually passed a law requiring that every state go to single winner districts. That was way back in 1842. That law actually got written off the books in the 1920s, but it was revived in 1967. And the reason, I mean, even the year gives a clue as to its reason. The Supreme Court had just announced its one person, one vote cases, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had just been passed. And basically there was a fear. Right after the Voting Rights Act was passed, people didn't think that the Voting Rights Act applied to this sort of thing. It was really only applied to access issues, you know, things like poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and all that sort of thing. And so one thing that we saw a bunch of local places do after the passage of the Voting Rights Act is say, well, if we can't deny the vote to these communities, we'll make sure they aren't able to elect anyone. And they did that by switching from district elections to at-large elections with a winner-take-all rule, just like that old general ticket system that had been used in Congress. So around 1967, the one person, one vote cases had just come out. which immediately rendered almost every congressional district map unconstitutional. So a bunch of states were redistricting. And there was a real concern that states in the South particularly would just elect at large and dilute the votes of the communities of color in their states. And so in 1967, Congress passed the single winner district mandate that is still on the books to this day. So this kind of interplay that we see between at-large elections and district elections. And at-large elections have a very bad name in the voting rights community because they have this history of voter suppression, really. And
Yeah.
so,
And I think that's important to kind of harp on that, because it turns out, and that it was kind of drilled to me by my voting rights employer early on, is that it's not just the at-large system that dilutes and submerges the voting strength of the protected minority. It's the winner-take-all as applied that actually does that, that causes the dilution. So, the same way you can actually draw a line and spread that protected minority across many different districts, single-member districts, there's a way to be nefarious in all sorts of different ways. So I think it's important to also see that how modified and large can actually be more inclusive of protected minorities, because, like the case in Mission Viejo, or, the city of Albany, who's proposing adopting it right now as a ballot measure. You can't find a single precinct where the protected minority groups are more than 28%. You can't draw a district for them, but citywide, when the threshold is 25%, they might have an actual chance and opportunity to elect a candidate of choice.
Right. The next question: does Trump remain in office past January 2021 while litigation continues? Not really my area of expertise, but my understanding is that the answer to that question is no. But it's also a complicated issue. So the election law expert Rick Hasen has his listserv of election lawyers, and I swear they argue over this topic or related topics pretty much every week. They wind up rehashing the same back and forth. Everyone is focused on the presidential election right now, of course. One area that isn't ranked choice voting that Fair Vote actually does have a lot of national expertise in is in electors, and particularly the issue of faithless electors. So when electors vote for another candidate. And that's become a big topic lately, particularly with Donald Trump testing positive for COVID. As much as you'd like to stay focused on the health of people for their own sake, people naturally wonder, well, what happens if he's incapacitated? And the issue is, who do the electors vote for? Who gets selected? It's a really thorny topic, and we're living in pretty unusual times. It's possible that all of this gets resolved in a way that is not necessarily predictable just by reference to precedent. But there are sort of models in place for what the electors would be able to do in order to select somebody. Otherwise, litigation continues, and it's just a gray area that I hope we don't wind up going down that path. Frankly, because there's not the Constitution kind of assumes that there'll be a peaceful transition without actually laying in place the procedure for that peaceful transition to occur when it's resisted. So, we'll see, I guess, is really the only answer I can give to that. And then the question of other voting models besides ranked choice voting. So proportional representation, usually if you hear somebody use the word proportional representation, often they're talking about systems that are used in Europe and in Latin America and all over the world that are very different from ranked choice voting. They're often talking about party list systems. So in a lot of countries, instead of voting for a candidate at all, you vote for a political party. And then if you vote for the Greens and the Greens get 10% of the vote, then that means they get 10% of the seats in the national legislature. And there's lots of different ways of doing this. The United States, that would be a very challenging thing to implement, both because we have a culture of distrust for political parties, and people are particularly dissatisfied with the two parties we have right now at this point in history. But when proportional representation as a way of voting was invented in the 1850s, 1860s, ranked choice voting was one of the very first methods that was created, and it started being used in Denmark. It was actually independently invented in Denmark and in England, like simultaneously, which is something that happens sometimes. Usually it sort of speaks to how it was needed. This was a time when working people had rising literacy rates, and there was like the Communist Manifesto had just been written, and basically there were new political forces rising up, and proportional representation started spreading as a way to incorporate those new ideas without necessarily suppressing them, because it was found that suppressing them generally just led to violence and revolution. We're kind of in a time like that in the United States right now. Like, I don't necessarily want to overstate it, but things are more polarized in American elections than they have been ever, as far as people have measured it. Now, arguably, they were more polarized during the Civil War and right before it. We don't have measurements of it then, but there's a lot going on right now that's pretty similar to how things looked just before the Civil War. We obviously don't want the constitutional structure to break down entirely. And with questions like the one we had about peaceful transition of presidential power, like we're, 2 minutes to midnight, in terms of what we're looking at there. And proportional representation, proportional ranked choice voting is almost certainly the way that proportional representation will come to the United States. And the case for it is looking more and more urgent all the time. People are frustrated with the choices they have. And at the same time, the forces that are in power are at each other's throats in a way that they haven't been historically. Something has to happen to change all that. And proportional ranked choice voting is a solution that would alleviate some of that pressure.
Yeah, and I look to what other countries are doing, and I actually find like New Zealand quite inspirational in many ways. They have basically proportional ranked choice voting for city elections, and they have like a dual ticket for their national elections, and it's a proportional system as well. And what it does is it allows both kind of like this geographic larger representation opportunities, and this idea of like a multi-seat congressional plan is called the Fair Representation Act. It's HR 4000. It's the idea is to have an American style of proportional representation, much like what is used in Ireland, and it's multi-seat districts, possibly adding 100 more seats. So you can have the Bay Area elect perhaps a libertarian or an urban Republican, or maybe you would have the South elect Democrats, like rural Democrats again. Maybe you would have your Democratic Socialist, but you would also have your Tea Party person elected as well. The idea is for the coalitions to be formed after the election, and to people actually conduct the business of the people with the ideas that they bring. Another idea, I guess it's not really an election. I like sortition. That's another one, which is the idea of randomly selecting people by lot to represent us. Because what better way to take out special interests out of politics by putting actual power in people's hands?
And that is used for that is used in less significant ways. Yeah, citizens assemblies have been used to make decisions, including in Ireland. They actually hold a constitutional convention regularly, 2/3 of which is selected by lot. And it's pretty interesting watching I've actually watched video of the Irish Assembly debating electoral methods, and you'll see they'll be presented. So they currently use proportional ranked choice voting to elect their legislature, and they'll be presented with the idea of, well, should we just go to single winner districts? Everybody just votes for one, the person with the most votes gets elected. And you'll see these regular, ordinary people, not like politically, not particularly politically wonky people, just look at that and say, that sounds terrible. How limiting, to only be able to select a single choice and only have one person supposedly representing all of the diverse views in a particular area, it's just instantly rejected once people see the power of this system. It's actually a good segue to from what you were saying, Pedro, about parties, because somebody did ask, how does this idea fare among the parties? So Pedro mentioned the Fair Representation Act. There's also a bill in Congress called the Ranked Choice Voting Act. The Fair Representation Act implements proportional ranked choice voting for the House of Representatives. The Ranked Choice Voting Act implements single winner ranked choice voting for both the House and the Senate. The Ranked Choice Voting Act has more co-sponsors than the Fair Representation Act, but both bills are at this point only co-sponsored by Democrats. And there may be various very simple reasons for that. For example, it's a federal mandate on states, which is something that is arguably contrary to conservative values. But I also mentioned it's become politically polarized in Maine. The very first use of it for congressional elections led to a Democrat beating a Republican who led in first choices. This led to the perception that a seat was essentially taken from Republicans using ranked choice voting. Around the country, however, it's very bipartisan. So one of the places where this idea has really gained traction lately is the state of Utah, where the Utah Republican Party has a history of using this internally in their party elections, single winner ranked choice voting. And they have traditionally in Utah actually nominated candidates by convention, but the state passed a law saying you actually have to hold a primary election and people can petition to get directly into the primary election, which made it possible for somebody to win with a plurality for the first time in Utah history. And suddenly this idea of ranked choice voting spread. And there are now a couple of cities in Utah using it already and more considering it. And effort at the state level among state legislators to introduce ranked choice voting, led by a bipartisan team, essentially both Republicans and Democrats. We see Republican-led bills in other states as well. Obviously, the system does not reference political parties. It's completely party neutral. So it doesn't actually favor any party over the other. But for various reasons, it can take on a partisan lens in various places.
Yeah, I'll add that our local options bill in California had bipartisan support as well. It was a ranked choice voting bill to allow for the use of proportional ranked choice voting and single seat ranked choice voting. And the single seat ranked choice voting was made to kind of address expensive contingent runoff elections. For example, you could have a 2-round runoff when you could have just had it in one election and actually save the taxpayers money in giving that choice to the local jurisdiction. We also had support from the ACLU, who wanted to see it pass because 95% of district attorneys in California are elected in these low turnout primary elections, and what this would have done is giving those counties the option to move all their elections to a single November election when turnout is higher. And they kind of saw that as a way to make sure that there's more accountability to a broader, more diverse electorate.
Yeah, the Fair Representation Act was first introduced in 2017, and that was a time when there was essentially unified Republican control. So electoral reform is usually not very favorable with a group that has just won everything under the current system. I fully expect it to become more bipartisan over time. And as we head into the 2021 redistricting session, a lot of people are going to be very frustrated with what's going on. So the redistricting that took place after the 2010 census was sort of notoriously corrupt, and essentially Republicans owned that. They very intentionally targeted state legislatures where they would have the ability to draw districts, and redistricting reform as a result became kind of partisan. After 2020, though, the Republicans don't have the power to do that again, nor do the Democrats, for that matter. There are a lot more divided state legislatures than there were in 2011. And we're just going to see a lot of fights over redistricting, very vicious fights. And what I like to say is, every minute, every hour, every dollar that's spent trying to influence district lines rather than trying to attract voters based on ideas, That's proof of how diluted our votes have become. Our elections shouldn't be decided by district lines. And I think that's a message that basically anybody can get behind. Nobody likes fighting over districts. And nobody likes the state that Congress is in with the level of polarization that it has. So my hope is that there'll be a big opening with both major parties. And I see we're a little over time, so maybe I'll stop there. I don't think we have any more questions either.
Thank you, Pedro and Drew, for that really informative presentation on ranked choice voting. I really can't imagine a better way that we could have closed out the conference other than learning about these changes that we can advocate for as voters, to make sure that our votes count. So thank you again for your work advocating for electoral reform.
Thank you.
Before we leave you all today, we'd like to thank the people who helped us make this possible. Of course, we're so grateful for the participation of all of the speakers you heard from today. A special thank you to Amy Marcellana for all of her help with marketing and technical expertise. And we'd of course like to thank all of the Emory students who volunteered behind the scenes to help make the conference a success. And thank you to Drew Selden, our EPIC president, for your continued support throughout the planning process. And finally, thank you, Dean Sheffy, for being there at every step of the way to help us successfully execute EPIC's first ever virtual conference. Dean Sheffy is not only EPIC's staff advisor, but she runs the law school's Public Service Center, tirelessly curating public interest events and opportunities for law students and making sure as many students as possible receive a summer public interest grant through EPIC. We are so appreciative for her support and guidance. We would like to turn it over to her to give a few closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Claire. And this has been a phenomenal conference. So I just want to add my thanks to you and Chelsea for the first ever virtual EPIC conference. I cannot imagine how it could have ever been any more successful. The speakers were great. The attendees stayed with us through the whole conference. And so that was awesome. I echo the thanks to Amy as well, and also thank Dean Babinski for who started us off this morning and did the welcome. So those are the thank yous. The other thing that I want to do is a sort of quick call to action. I'd be remiss if I didn't note that EPIC also has another major event that will be February the 2nd, 2021, which is our 25th annual Inspiration Awards. And the primary goal of that event is to help raise money for summer grants for students just like Claire and Chelsea who work in unfunded summer public interest positions. So I included the link in the chat. Anyone who's interested in helping support those grants, we'd love to have you support us. If you have any questions, please let us know. And to echo what a number of our panelists said earlier today, there's obviously several things that you can do. One is to vote. So some of us have our absentee ballots and are planning to do that now, but please make sure that you get out and vote. The second is to volunteer if you can. We had several of our speakers talk about the urgent need for poll workers, and there's lots of other positions as well. So if you're in a position where you can do that, then please do what you can to reach out and help support voting rights. We are still in very much an ongoing fight for voting rights in this country. But just one final thank you to Claire and Chelsea. It really has been phenomenal. It's been great to watch them coordinate this entire conference. And as I said, for the first ever virtual conference, it was efficient, on time, educational, informative, and provocative. And so it couldn't have gone better. So great kudos to you guys. And thank you everybody for spending part of your Saturday with us, and hope you enjoyed the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.